Dive into fascinating world of learning with our brand new podcast series, where we unravel the secrets behind the fundamental human process. Join us as we embark on an eye-opening journey exploring the mysteries, breakthroughs, and misconceptions that surround the art of learning. In our debut episode, together with neuroscientist Dr. Domink Rus, we shine a spotlight on myths of learning. Prepare to have your preconceptions challenged as we debunk common misconceptions surrounding the learning process. Through thought-provoking discussions and expert insight, we will explore whether traditional beliefs about learning hold true, or if it's time to embrace a new perspective. In preparation for today's episode, I read a couple of articles, but what I find actually very striking is when you put in the Google search word learning, I got back approximately 7 billion results. That to me looks like everybody has an opinion about learning, everybody is talking about learning, but if you have to basically define it in a very simple way, what would you say learning is? And one thing that I noticed here before I give you the floor, that even learning and development professionals quite often don't have the same understanding what learning is.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, Ivica. Before I answer the question, what I think learning is, let's kind of unpack like your initial statement that everyone has opinions about learning, right? So here's what's going on. Two things. One is everyone's gone to school, right? Everyone has gone through some kind of formal learning, right? Some kind of formal education, even though you might only have elementary school education, you have gone through some kind of formal learning, right? So you have formed opinions about learning. And the second thing is, everyone has opinions about learning because we learn constantly. It's something we do on a daily basis. We're constantly learning. We are a species that has been evolving. We're still evolving, right? So you need to evolve and adapt to the environment. Right. So we're learning and everyone has opinions about this, right? Although you might not have been in school for 20, 30, 40 years, you're still learning, right? You're learning new things, right? Yeah. So, and that's why we have different definitions of learning, right? There's people who would define learning from a sociological perspective, thinking about, the setting, the sociological setting, the school setting, either it's formal, informal, an informal or formal education setting, right? And then there's people who have a more like a neurobiological perspective of learning, like me, because I was trained as a cognitive neuroscientist of learning and memory. So my understanding of learning is pretty different from, people who would define it through a sociological lens, for example, right? You might be a psychologist, so you define it through a psychological theory of learning. But one thing that we need to all agree to is learning is one of those higher level sociological cognitive faculties, right? We call it, something like memory is a higher level cognitive faculty, cognitive function, if you will. Attention is a high level cognitive function, and learning is also a high level cognitive function, right? And one thing that I would always add, it is a cognitive function, a psychological function, but it has, here's the thing. This is the most important part. It has a neurobiological basis, right?
So Dominic, if we stay with this cognitive and let's say also use the neurobiological basis, you mentioned that we learn every day, right? We learn something. So if you have to move, let's say, from the theoretical into practical, so what would you say, let's say an example, how do we learn every day? And then what happens in terms of the cognitive?
We are learning every day, Ivica, but not everything counts as learning. So if you want to memorize a shopping list and before you go to a supermarket to buy your groceries, is that learning? Probably not, because it's not going to go from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, right? And you're never going to use that shopping list again, right? If you cram for an exam, even in a formal educational setting, you cram for an exam and you go through 35 pages of Roman history, and you then take an exam the next day and you forget all about that, that is not learning from a neurobiological perspective. So for learning to take place, you need to move the information that you got through your senses, whether it's touch, whether it's hearing, whether it's vision, and you need to move that information, that content, from short-term memory to long-term memory. That's what counts as learning from a neurobiological perspective. So you see,
So
we
how do
learn
we
all the
this
time,
happen?
but not everything is learning, right?
I agree with you, but how do we then ensure, or how do we create, let's say, the experience or the process or the
Yeah.
environment that will actually stimulate that learning to take place? What would you say?
So that's the $1 million question for learning design and learning experience design, right? So how do we make sure that our learning design really counts as learning, so that our participants are really going to learn? They're not just going to have fun, and they're not going to forget all that content. That's where learning science kicks in. And I always say to instructional designers and learning experience designers, you need to bake or embed into your learning design learning science. And we have so much evidence about how humans learn, not just from the past 10, 15 years. We've known from over a century, even more, how humans learn. Let's go back to like 1885, Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? People were laughing at him when he was doing experiments on himself, but he came up with this forgetting curve, studying nonsense syllables and syllable combinations. But the forgetting curve has been proven over and over and over and over again for over 100 years, right? So we've known for a long time how humans forget. So it really surprises me when you go to even high level fancy learning design, and people have all these beautiful, sexy technologies, yet training is completely like a waste of time. It's completely ineffective because they don't take that learning science into consideration, right? So this is key. It's transferring your short-term memories into long-term memories, right? And there's different techniques out there. We've known for decades what techniques work best. What's really sad that even in our learning and development field, most people still don't know about this. They still think that reading, rereading, listening, going through self-paced e-learning courses, just listening to someone talk, just going through videos is just going to magically transform those, transition those from short-term memory to long-term memory. And the reality is most of that training is completely ineffective and completely just a complete waste of time, right?
And if you want to make it an effective, so if, let's say, you can give us one example or one advice, what would be the approach that you would suggest?
So research shows that
as you said, there are many different ways to do it.
Research shows, and that comes from Dunlowski and his lab mainly. They've been doing this for like the past 15 years. Research has shown over and over and over again that one of the most effective, or the most effective learning techniques, or by extension teaching techniques, is quizzing, self-quizzing that involves spaced repetition, right? So I learned something on a Monday. Let's say I go to a new hire training on a Monday, and then I need to repeat that content just when that forgetting curve kind of kicks in. When I'm about to forget that content, I need to refresh it. That's called, psychologists call this active retrieval. You retrieve that from your memory, because if you don't, it's forgotten, right? And again, that goes back to Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. So one of the most effective learning techniques is to put that quizzing either it could be self-quizzing by the learner, or it could be something that's done from by the learning design team. But as soon as the learner is about to forget that piece of information, you need to refresh their memories. It's usually, if you look at the forgetting curve, it's usually 2 to 3 days after the training event. Can you review everything and refresh everything? Absolutely not. You don't have time for that. But if you're teaching a sales model on Monday or a customer service model on a Monday, you need to refresh that on a Wednesday, for example, Wednesday or Thursday, right? You can't just expect that the learner will know all that by the time they graduate, 10, 14, 21 days later.
So basically, spaced repetition and reflection, if I can put it like that, are extremely important and critical for learning to take place. What about the experience? If we basically give the opportunity, during the learning process to the participants to apply immediately and to test some of those theoretical models, to basically apply immediately knowledge on practical examples.
So experiential learning has been shown over and over again that it's better than just lecture-based learning, or now in the new modern world, right? It's all about virtual learning. just going through, I call them hitting the space button e-learning courses, right? The same thing as going through like lecture-based training. Really, it's not really effective unless you add spaced retrieval, right? And quizzing, right? But I think you mentioned reflection. Before I go into practice, let's talk about reflection, because you mentioned reflection. Reflection and all these other cognitive techniques have been shown again by Dunlosky and his peers, his colleagues, over and over again. They are effective, but they're not as effective as quizzing and spaced repetition, for example. So these cognitive meta cognitive approaches, like reflecting upon learning, one of them is called interrogative elaboration. I elaborate in my mind what this new learning means to me and how this affects me, for example, in my knowledge, my current knowledge. And I've heard this over and over again, Ivica. Reflection, adults learn through reflection. And I would always say, no, reflection is important, but it doesn't suffice. You need to have spacing, space retrieval, and quizzing, and then you can add reflection to this, right? And reflection has always been part of these experiential learning models, going back to Kolb in the 70s, right? I'm sure you've read about Kolb. Kolb and his colleagues showed back in the 70s.
It's before my time, but I read it.
Yeah, before our time. And they would show that experiential learning that has this hands-on component yields a much better recall, long-term memory recall, compared to just lecture-based learning. And you know what's happening across our organizations today? We're still so hooked on that PowerPoint. And even in the virtual environment, flashing PowerPoint through Zoom or Slack or Teams, right? We used to call it death by PowerPoint. I now call it death by PowerPoint through Teams or death by PowerPoint through Zoom, right? It's not yielding that long-term memory recall, right? No matter how much you reflect, if you don't supplement reflection with quizzing and with spacing, distribution and spacing, you're not going to get the bang for the buck that you need, right? So again, short answer would be yes, reflection is important, but it's not enough.
But somehow also, and thank you, Dominic, for this, for correcting me, and also teaching me about, what works, what doesn't work. You mentioned also that death by PowerPoint and, now is death by PowerPoint through Teams or through Zoom or any other technology. Right. It looks to me that no matter how fast technology is actually developing, we're still basically doing the same thing. We are just using different media.
Yeah. So, I think that's the best way. I couldn't have put it better than you did. We're still using, back in the 80s, people would use those overhead projectors, right? And now we're using fancy PowerPoints. And then people would say, oh, Dom, we've kind of shifted away from PowerPoint. We're now using Mentimeter or Kahoot or whatever. But you're still flashing slides through, whether it's a face-to-face, stand-up, kind of like brick and mortar environment or a virtual environment. I am seeing people doing this over and over again. Like it's all over the place, all over the map, across the organizations, including in the developed world. Yes, we might have these fancy training delivery technologies, but we're doing the same thing. So the brain gets the same type of stimuli, right? It's still visual stimulus that, you're reading something off of the screen, just like you did through overhead projectors in the 80s and maybe some smart boards in the 90s, early 2000s. And now we have these other training delivery technologies, but the stimulus is still the same. It's just visual stimulus on a different piece of technology, right? Hasn't changed.
Don, what would you say? What is the main reason why we can kind of not detach from that same approach? Is it because we just don't want to kind of accept learning science and theory and apply it in a different way? Or what would you say is the main reason why we are constantly forcing
One is definitely the lack of understanding of learning science and how people learn. Most L&D professionals, and I've been in this field for like 15 years now, most of them have no clue about how humans learn, how the brain learns, or how the brain doesn't learn for that matter, right? So they just deploy these techniques that Dunlosky would say are a complete waste of time: reading, rereading, listening, re-listening, watching with videos mindlessly. We've known for the past 20 years that doesn't work. One of them is definitely lack of understanding, lack of access to this research. L&D professionals kind of like work in a silo, and the researchers are not really interacting with the professionals, with the practitioners. And I think I've always called myself like, this kind of like the bridge. I've always been saying I've been building the bridge between research and practice, kind of teaching the practitioners, what the researchers would say, kind of like, bridging the two, bridging the gap. And then the other reason might be just convenience. It's just much more convenient to put something on a PowerPoint deck versus going out and researching all these technologies. And I want to add the third one, and especially with the technology. Now there's technologies everywhere, Ivica, as you've noticed. And we're now obsessing about AI technology, generative AI in learning and development. But let's be honest, most AI technology does not simulate how we learn. It is fancy, yes. We got all these, language models, but that doesn't mean that, it's helping us design better, more efficient learning experiences. And I've been following these heated discussions on LinkedIn for the past 6 months or so, and I'm seeing these prompts that people are using, asking OpenAI's ChatGPT or Google's Bard things, and they would use prompts like, give me a lesson plan for the following content, accounting for all learning styles, right? And we've known for decades that learning styles do not exist. Research is very clear about that. Yet learning professionals are still using these terms in their prompts, right? So if they don't have access to the right, evidence to research informed or evidence-based learning, if they're still using what they were using 30, 40 years ago for convenience, then they're not going to be changing their prompts, because it starts with the mindset. I always say you need to change the mindset, and then the skill set, and then the tool set. So I think we're going in the opposite direction. We're obsessing about tool set without really upskilling and reskilling as learning and development professionals. And most of the prompts that I've seen in the last 6 months are just completely wrong, inaccurate, almost ridiculous, to be honest. Like, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but like a lot of prompts that I've seen are just useless and just inaccurate, scientifically speaking, right?
Dom, before we go too far, because today we were not necessarily planning to talk about learning styles, but since you mentioned that, and maybe, same like we started with the learning to basically define what it is and what is not, in terms of learning style, you're absolutely right that there is still a lot of learning and development professionals that are using this as a base. And you said we know for decades that basically they don't exist or they don't necessarily work.
Right.
Can you just maybe, again, in a very simple terms, explain why they don't exist and why this is basically big,
So,
lie?
one thing, one thing is for sure. I get pressed on this all the time, Ivica. So yeah, it's a great question. One thing is for sure, we do have preferences for learning, right? I don't know, maybe you're a night owl and you prefer to learn at night in bed reading. But that doesn't mean that is the most effective way of learning in your case. You just got used to it because you've created all these habits. 50% of what we do is habits, habitual. We've known that, for a long time. So you have created these habits that work for you. But this gives you this idea of this illusionary learning. You are thinking, I learn better in bed at night reading, but that's your preference because you've created this habit. So habits exist. We're habitual creatures, but that doesn't mean that you learn better by reading and not by doing it, right? Like, going back to this experiential learning. So people will come to me and say, I'm a visual learner, I prefer to read. No, not really. That doesn't mean that you're better off reading versus speaking versus touching things, right? So research has shown over and over again, when you account for these different learning styles, as people call them, you don't yield better recall, you don't yield better learning. So you might give someone who says that he or she learns better by visuals or through visuals, and that he or she is a visual learner. And research has shown that, giving them visuals only doesn't make them better learners. in the
Basically,
sense
because of
of
the
they,
habits, we convince ourselves that one is working
yes,
better than the other, but
yeah,
scientifically, we see that there is basically no difference, right?
true, exactly, yeah, exactly
Well,
right.
thank you for this demystifying that. I
Yeah,
think it's very
yeah.
important, especially for the audience that will be listening to this. And Dom, if you go back to the experience, why is
Mhm.
experience in learning important? Like again, similar like to the learning style, if you create a positive and effective experience, would it actually stimulate learning process and gain more in terms of the learning impact? Or again, it's another myth. What would you say?
Yeah, so not every experience is a learning experience, right? Let's unpack this word experience. What is experience? It's everything you're conscious of. You go to a concert and you love the experience, right? Or I was in London with my family a couple of weeks ago, and they all wanted to go to this big Ferris wheel, right? The London Eye. And it was a great experience. We love taking pictures with my family and talking to each other. But did I learn anything from this? Absolutely not. I didn't learn anything. It was an awesome, fantastic experience, but it wasn't a learning experience, right? So this obsession about, not really obsession, it's also a scientific question. How do you make sure that while people are learning, they have this same feeling that, like you have when you go to a concert or a theater play or to the movies, or, you go on London Eye in London. How do you make sure that people get this experience when they're learning? And this is where the disconnect is. When we put the learning experiences together, they're usually boring. They don't really, yield these positive emotions, right? Like they would when you go to the movies or a theater. And this is the $1 million question. How do you put a learning program together that would evoke these emotions that you would get in these other experiences,